Leopoldo Metlicovitz was born in Trieste on the northeastern coast of Italy in 1868, the son of a merchant from Dalmatia. In his teens, while working as an apprentice lithographer, he came to the attention of Giulio Ricordi, the owner of the prestigious Ricordi studios in Milan, and he was impressed enough to offer the young Metlicovitz a job at the company. In the coming years with Ricordi, he completed his training as a lithographer, but continued to draw and paint in his own time. And in 1892, at the age of only 24, he became the company's technical director, supervising the reproduction of posters by established illustrators such as Adolfo Hohenstein and Giovanni Maria Mattelloni. But by 1896, Metlicovitz had begun designing his own posters, all of which harnessed both his creative skills and the deep understanding he had acquired of the constraints and possibilities of traditional stone lithography. Among others he created at this time was a grandiose poster for the aperitif Fernet Branca, which was published throughout Europe and even the USA. And it proved so popular the company used it on the bottle labels, and it's still the logo for the product in more graphic form. Most of his designs at this time conformed to the principles of what was known in France as Art Nouveau and in Germany as Jugendstil, but the Italians called Stile Liberty. And Metlicovitz was considered to be one of its leading exponents. Just like its counterparts, it was generally defined by the application of organic forms and decoration, combined with the predominant use of single figures, frequently but not exclusively female. And he used the identical approach for other Ricordi printed materials such as decorative wall calendars. At the end of the 19th century, the Mele department store in Naples, known for fashion and luxury items, became a significant client for Ricordi. And Metlicovitz was chosen as one of several of their most prominent illustrators to create advertising material for their well-heeled clientele. By the early years of the 20th century, the obvious aesthetic qualities of his work led to him becoming an indispensable creative asset to the company, with a series of impressive emotionally charged posters. And in addition to his ongoing and growing volume of poster work, he also applied his skills to the covers of sheet music of popular songs of the period. However much he was linked to the Stile Liberty movement, he didn't let it hamper his exploration of other graphic approaches, and alongside the more expected dramatic figure work, there was also the occasional stylistic oddity, such as this exercise in line and flat colour from 1903. Ricordi's fortunes were inextricably linked to the music business, and in addition to the striking posters Metlicovitz created for the opera, he also produced illustrated postcards, which were themed for specific productions, and they proved immensely popular with the public. It's also recorded that he worked as a costume designer on various productions at La Scala Theatre, but strangely I only found this solitary image to back up the claim. His association with Fernet Branca also diversified into the publication of a series of scenic watercolour evocations of various Italian locations. But the absence of figure work and inferior print quality of these postcards rendered them less visually compelling than his figure-based posters. These occasional landscapes aside, it was undoubtedly with his more figurative work he had the greatest success, and the sheet music covers he continued to produce for Ricordi provided him with ideal material to create romantically themed scenarios incorporated into the cover designs. Many of the posters he was creating at this point were a highly successful blend of neoclassical figures in conjunction with 20th century technology and transportation, such as this memorable example from 1905. But a year later he had even greater success with the poster design he produced to promote the Great Universal Exposition in Milan. This remarkably distinctive and impossible to ignore blend of fantasy and technology was undoubtedly one of his most admired creations. Whether technologically themed or not, posters featuring dramatically posed, nude or partially clad figures of both sexes were almost invariably the focus of his output at this time. and it seems likely that their visual dominance and association with the classical world was a bid to replicate the popularity of his Milan exposition poster. And to ensure the authenticity of his anatomical visualizations, he invariably created them from posed models, many of which he photographed to use as reference. In 1907, Metlicovitz also turned his hand to creating cover illustrations for the magazine Arts et Labor, also published by Ricordi, for which he used the more graphic, primarily flat-coloured aspect of his creative spectrum. And in addition to this and his many posters, he continued to create images for other materials such as calendars and postcards for his employers. In the same year, he travelled to Buenos Aires to oversee the management of a local printing firm on Ricordi's behalf, but he still found time to create a couple more posters. In 1908, he ventured again into more scenic territory with this uncharacteristic travel poster promoting the charms of Venice. But otherwise, it was only natural that Ricordi's links with operatic productions would continue to be an ever-present theme in Metlicovitz's output during the first decade of the 20th century. And in every case, he successfully conveyed the prevailing mood from the darkly dramatic to light and frivolous with considerable prowess. But as the second decade of the century came around, other more commercially oriented posters were commissioned alongside the prodigious amount of operatic publicity. And these received the almost identical treatment by Metlicovitz, with romance and melodrama well to the fore in the majority of cases. And among others, the Mele department store continues to be one of the company's major clients. In 1910, at the height of his success, Metlicovitz married the actress Elvira Lazzaroni, and the couple had 2 children. In that year, he returned with Elvira to Argentina, and Ricordi attempted to persuade him to stay there to manage their operations in the country. But Metlicovitz declined the offer and returned to Milan. Varying degrees of nakedness in his figure work continued to be an ever-present aspect of his posters, and although most carried on in the neoclassically themed images he produced, there were a couple of others created at this time advertising perfume, which were manifestly intended to be erotic in their appeal. Although it was by no means Metlicovitz's only approach to the composition of his posters, and there were some notable exceptions to the rule, it was evident that he was disinclined to bother overmuch with detailed background or scene setting, and in some instances dispense with it altogether, further compelling the viewer to focus on the figure work. And in other cases he would simply suggest an environment by reducing the background element to a few simple flat colours, creating a similar focus on the figure. And in 1912 Metlicovitz created this far from expected dynamically composed poster for Pirelli tyres, without reference to figures of any kind, clothed or otherwise. In the same year, among many others, he created this poster for a production of the opera The Blue Spider, and I was lucky enough to find this close-up section with enough resolution to give a clear indication of just how these complicated images were created. It's all too easy to forget that these posters were not produced photolithographically from paintings, but had to be converted to separate elements on as many as a dozen different lithographic stones, each of which printed just one of the colours. And they had to be accurately registered with the others if they were to be successful. Equally, it might also be worth pointing out that frequently the print run for many of these posters, and particularly the theatrical ones, might only be around 50 in total. It was also in 1912 that Giulio Ricordi died, but he was immediately succeeded by his son Tito, who continued to run the company up to 1920. By this stage of his career, the organic frames and decorations of the Stila Liberty approach had largely evaporated in favour of simpler design. But his use of a single or on occasion a pair of figures continues to define the great majority of his images, and whether elaborately or simply rendered, they continue to be distinctive and popular with the public. It was also in this decade that he began creating equally melodramatic posters for Italian silent films, and among other commissions in 1914 Metlicovitz had no less than 4 alternative designs for the epic Cabiria published, although I could only pin down 2 of them to show here. Other film posters showed remarkable diversity in his approach, from the epic embattled wasteland of Germania to this powerful modernist single doomed figure for a film version of the tragic tale of the clown Pagliacci. 1914 was also the year the First World War began, and a year later Metlicovitz and his family relocated to Ponte Lambro in the northern Italian lakes, from where he continued to create posters for Ricordi. But later that same year, for reasons not recorded, his wife deserted him and their 2 children, and subsequently his sister moved into their home and became a surrogate mother and housekeeper. Despite his personal domestic misfortune, he continued to produce posters, but although the country was at war, he only created a couple of rousing allegorical patriotic images in support of Italy's military role in the conflict. But he was plainly a man who wasn't particularly interested in portrayals of real life, and from the end of the war into the 1920s, he returned with a vengeance to his beloved operatic themes, almost to the exclusion of all else. Although, as he had always done, he did take the occasional commission to produce advertising for 1 or 2 non-theatrical clients and manufacturers. By the early years of the 1920s, the modern world was at least occasionally finding its way into Metlicovitz's output, but there was the distinct feeling it was something he considered somewhat of an obligation, and whether for the opera or more mainstream commercial purposes, his apparently unshakable faith in the pursuit of neoclassical melodrama and intense emotion remained well to the fore. Nevertheless, there were some exceptions to the rule, and he did produce other atypical images, including more scenic work for Italian tourism and even 1 or 2 unexpected examples of frivolous humour in evidence. But whatever the mood or emotional pull of the individual images, and however they were rendered, Metlicovitz manifestly remained unmoved by the twin pillars of modernism in the form of Futurism and Art Deco, which were by this point taking over the stylistic flavour of the age right across Europe and to a lesser extent the USA. But perhaps surprisingly, despite his refusal to move with the times and follow prevailing fashion, the volume and variety of the many posters he produced throughout the decade bore testament to his enduring graphic talents. And among other iconic highlights produced in the 20s, he created this relatively well-known example for the opera Turandot, successfully combining tonally rendered portraiture with flat organic decoration. Many more followed up to the beginning of the 1930s, but at this point, even if he was still employed at Ricordi, his stylistic approach had become rather anachronistic in its appeal, and as the decade progressed, examples of his work started to become noticeably less frequent. There were even 1 or 2 examples which indicated he was by now, however grudgingly, incorporating some modern devices into his work, which looked somewhat incongruous with his traditionally rendered style. It may or not be significant, but what I couldn't find a single example of was any work at this time which indicated, even obliquely, that he had become, like so many of his contemporaries, a supporter of Mussolini's fascist government. By this point, the opera had become increasingly sidelined as films and modern dance music captured the interest of the majority of the public. And the last commercial image I found by Metlicovitz was this fittingly romantic evocation of a gladiator for an insurance company in 1939. By now he was in his 70s, and he retired completely from commercial work, but carried on as a painter up to his death in Ponte Lambro in 1944 at the age of 76. Leopoldo Metlicovitz was undoubtedly a key figure in the coming of age of poster design in 20th century Italy. But as with many of his countrymen, he doesn't seem to attract the admiration that his contemporaries in France receive. And I must admit that for reasons I have never been able to work out, Italy in general seems to have been unfairly overlooked in this regard. And yet the country's contribution is no less vital. And in addition to those I've already covered, I'm pleased to say I have certainly a few more illustrators of note from Italy to feature in the series. But for now, here are some more examples of Metlicovitz's graphic talents to play us out. Thanks as always for watching.